1931. The American road is a battlefield. In one corner, General Motors and their Detroit Diesel, the Empire. They built an engine that screams. In the other corner, Cummins, the Chauffeur. He built an engine that grunts. GM wanted speed. Klesse just wanted to be unkillable. To prove it, he took a tractor engine to the Indy 500. While the gas cars blew up, he ran 500 miles without a single pit stop on just $1.40 of furnace oil. This was the first shot in the horsepower wars, the scream versus the grunt, a rivalry that would storm the beaches of Normandy and divide the trucking world forever. But in the battle between speed and endurance, who actually won? Back in 1919, a diesel engine wasn't really an engine, it was a building. These were massive stationary slabs of iron used to turn generators or push ships. You didn't put them on wheels, and you certainly didn't use them to speed down a highway. On one side, you had General Motors. They were rapidly becoming the biggest industrial force on Earth. They had the money, the city block-sized laboratories, and armies of engineers in white coats. On the other side, you had Cummins. Klesse didn't wear a white coat. He was a chauffeur for the wealthy Irwin family in Columbus, Indiana. But he had a backer. William G. Irwin put up $50,000, a fortune back then, because he saw something in his driver. Klesse was the kind of guy who learned by breaking things until they stopped breaking. He believed you could shrink a diesel down and make it mobile. Most engineers called that a fantasy. But Klesse knew that to beat the gasoline engine, he didn't need to be faster. He just needed to be unkillable. That philosophy led to one of the most desperate stunts in automotive history. 1931, the Indianapolis 500. The Brickyard was the altar of speed, built for high-octane gas cars to scream until they either won or blew up. Klesse showed up with a diesel. He entered car number 8. It was heavy and it ran a 4-stroke cycle. The crowd probably laughed when they heard it fire up. It didn't sound like a race car, it sounded like a tractor. But while the gas cars were tearing into pits to refuel and fix overheating radiators, car number 8 just kept circling. It ran the entire 500 miles without a single pit stop. It finished 13th on just $1.40 worth of furnace oil. It didn't win the race, but it finished when faster cars didn't. That stunt proved the diesel engine could survive the American road. While Klesse was proving reliability, General Motors was rewriting the physics. They hired Charlie Boss Kettering. Kettering had a philosophy he called intelligent ignorance. Basically, if you don't know something is impossible, you might just accidentally invent it. Kettering looked at the 4-stroke diesel and decided it was lazy. He wanted every movement of the piston to deliver power. The result was the 2-stroke diesel. Unlike the 4-stroke, this thing fired once every revolution. GM poured millions into it. They built it for trains first, then used their mass production muscle to shrink it down. The result was an engine that was lighter, snapped to attention the moment you touched the throttle, and produced a scream that would eventually define the American highway. They called it the Series 71. By the late 30s, the battle lines were drawn. You had the heavy, grunting 4-stroke from Indiana and the lightweight, high-revving 2-stroke from Detroit. Then, the world caught fire. When World War II broke out, the Army didn't care about patents. They needed power, and they needed it everywhere. This is where the two philosophies found their true purpose. The military looked at GM's 2-stroke and saw speed. They dropped the Detroit 671 engines into the LCVP landing craft, the Higgins boats. Watch the footage from the Normandy invasion. The sound of boats hitting the beach? That is the sound of a Detroit diesel. They needed an engine that could rev high and respond instantly to the coxswain's throttle to fight the surf and the tide. It was violent, loud, and fast. But while GM was screaming on the beaches, Cummins was quietly powering the background. The Army didn't drop Cummins engines into the supply trucks. Those were still largely running on gasoline. Instead, the military realized that the unkillable nature of the Cummins diesel made it perfect for something else: endurance. Cummins engines became the standard for the heavy-duty generators that powered the war. They ran the radar systems that scanned the skies. They lit the field hospitals and powered the communication hubs. They ran day and night in freezing cold and jungle heat, often ignored, but never failing. The war was a global proving ground. It showed there wasn't just one way to build a diesel. If you needed to storm a beach and fight the tide, you used the screaming two-stroke. If you needed to keep a base alive for weeks without a hiccup, you used the grunting four-stroke. By 1945, the soldiers were coming home. They had already spent years surrounded by that noise. They knew the scream of a Detroit meant speed, and the steady hum of a Cummins meant reliability. The war had validated both designs. But now, America was about to build the interstate highway system. The roads were opening up. The economy was speeding up. In this new era, the slow, steady reliability of a garage-built engine was about to run headfirst into the mass-produced dominance of the General. The battlefield was moving from the beaches of Normandy to the asphalt of Route 66, and the silence was about to be shattered. Post-war America didn't care about fuel economy. It cared about speed. To make money, you had to merge, pass, and hammer down. That world belonged to the Screaming Jimmy. The Detroit Diesel Series 71 didn't just run, it howled. Since it was a two-stroke, it fired twice as often as a Cummins at the same RPM. Add the whine of a Roots blower, and you had the sonic signature of the American road. That sound meant money. The Detroits were light, they had fewer moving parts, and they were snappy. You found them in Greyhound buses, fire trucks, and just about every rig on the highway. Mechanics loved them because parts were interchangeable across the whole lineup. You could rebuild a Jimmy on the shoulder with a basic toolkit. If you ran a fleet, Detroit was the only logical choice. But that dominance came with a nightmare scenario: the runaway. If the seals on that blower failed, the engine would start sucking its own lubricating oil into the cylinders. Since diesels run on oil, the engine treated its own lube as fuel. You could turn the key off, it didn't matter. The engine would rev uncontrollably, screaming louder and louder until it either drank all its oil and seized, or physically exploded. Old-timers knew that there was only one way to kill a runaway. You had to choke the air intake. You had to have the guts to stand next to a bomb and stuff a rag into the blower to starve it of oxygen. While Detroit dealt with explosions, the rest of the industry faced a simpler problem: gravity. Trucks were getting heavier. The drum brakes of the 50s couldn't handle stopping 80,000 pounds on a long grade. Clessie Cummins had known this fear for decades. Back in 1931, during his famous cross-country publicity run, he had nearly died on Cajon Pass when his brakes turned to mush. He survived by threading the needle between a cliff and a freight train, but the terror never left him. Now retired and pushed out of his own company, he finally had the time to solve it. He realized the diesel engine was just a massive air pump. If he could crack the exhaust valves open at the top of the compression stroke, the engine would absorb energy instead of making it. It would turn the truck's momentum against itself. He called it the compression release engine brake. It was a masterpiece of safety engineering. So, Clessie took the invention to his own company. By then, he was an outsider in the house he built. The new management looked at their aging founder and passed. They reportedly told him, "We build engines to make trucks go, not to make them stop." Clessie didn't quit. He walked down the street to a drill chuck manufacturer named Jacobs. That is why we call it the Jake brake, not the Cummins brake. It became one of the most essential components in trucking history. Every time you hear that machine gun rattle on an off-ramp, you are hearing Clessie's genius and the sound of the biggest missed opportunity in Cummins history. By 1965, Detroit owned the highway, and the Jake brake made the descent safer. But loads were getting heavier. The simple laws of thermodynamics were starting to turn against high-revving two-strokes. The era of the scream was hitting its thermal limit. By the late 1960s, the era of building the road was over. The era of moving the world's heaviest cargo had begun. Lengths increased. Gross vehicle weights skyrocketed. The Screaming Jimmy had dominated the short hauls with its frantic energy, but moving 80,000 pounds over the Rockies exposed a different set of rules. The game was no longer about engine speed. It was about thermal endurance. Cummins recognized this shift before anyone else. They had a workhorse engine, the NTC 855. In the 60s, it was good, but it wasn't yet a legend. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Suddenly, fuel didn't just cost money, it cost businesses their existence. While General Motors two-strokes were guzzling diesel, engineers in Columbus bet the company's future on a massive redesign of their 855 cubic inch inline six. History knows it as the Big Cam. The logic was elegant. By increasing the camshaft diameter from 2.0 to 2.5 inches, engineers could shorten the fuel injection duration while driving the pressure through the roof. The result? The fuel atomized better, the burn was cleaner, but most importantly, the engine ran cooler. It was a long, heavy block of iron designed to sit at a steady, rhythmic RPM for days at a time. It didn't scream, it grunted. But even Cummins got jealous. Watching Detroit Diesel dominate the market for cabovers, where the driver sits right on top of the engine, Cummins felt they were missing out. An inline six is long and awkward. Detroit's V engines were short and fit perfectly in those snub-nosed trucks. So Cummins tried to copy their rivals' homework. They released the V555. They called it the triple nickel. It was an attempt to shove Cummins' reliability into a V8 shape. It was a disaster. Drivers gave it darker names like Triple Trouble and Cripple 5. It lacked the displacement for low-end torque, and it broke down constantly. It was a harsh lesson. You cannot engineer against your own DNA. Cummins was a company of long strokes and inline blocks, not compact V8s. While the triple nickel failed, the real war moved to the most hostile environment on Earth, the Australian outback. Here, road trains pull 3 or 4 trailers at once. The heat in the Northern Territory exceeds 100 degrees, and the dust kills everything. This was the kill box where the horsepower wars were decided. The physics of a 2-stroke engine worked against Detroit Diesel in this furnace. Because a 2-stroke fires on every revolution, the piston eats fire twice as often as a 4-stroke. In a fire truck, the cooling system can keep up, but pulling 100 tons across the desert at full throttle, the thermal load was too high. Reports flooded in from the outback. Detroit engines were literally melting down. The liners couldn't shed heat fast enough, and oil temperatures spiked to critical levels. In contrast, the Cummins KTA-19 forged its legend right there in the dirt. This wasn't a truck engine. It was a massive 19-liter industrial power plant shoehorned into a truck chassis. With a massive oil capacity and a relaxed 4-stroke cycle, the KTA-19 ran at full load in the blistering heat without breaking a sweat. Some of these engines ran for 1 million miles before they needed a rebuild. It didn't care about the ambient temperature because it wasn't generating waste heat at the frantic pace of the 2-strokes. The verdict from the outback rippled back to the States. For heavy work, the inline 6 was king. The balance of the engine combined with the cooling efficiency of the 4-stroke cycle made it the only choice for the heaviest hauls. The Screaming Jimmy sounded fast, but the big cam made money. By the late 70s, the market swung violently. Fleets that had been loyal to Detroit for 30 years switched. The fuel crisis only accelerated it. The 4-stroke Cummins sipped fuel while the thirsty 2-stroke Detroits guzzled it. General Motors watched their dominance evaporate. Their engines were leaking oil, overheating, and burning cash. Desperation set in. Detroit Diesel was no longer the innovator. They were playing catch-up. Management demanded a solution to the leaks and the efficiency problems. They rushed development. They ignored the warning signs. In their haste to fix a leaking gasket, they were about to release an engine that wouldn't just leak oil, it would hemorrhage the company's remaining credibility. The Australian outback left Detroit Diesel bruised, but they weren't dead yet. Back in the States, GM engineers knew they had to shed the green leaker reputation to survive the 80s. Their answer was the Silver 92. They marketed it as a robust evolution, a refined machine designed to stop the leaks and reclaim the throne from Cummins. But they were fighting a ghost. The previous generation, the notorious green engines of the 70s, had committed a sin that the market couldn't forgive. The green 92s suffered from a catastrophic flaw called block fretting. In those early engines, the cylinder liners didn't sit still. Under the intense vibration, they shimmied against the block, acting like sandpaper. This friction wore down the metal ledges holding the liners, creating gaps. Once that seal broke, the coolant bypassed the O-rings and dumped straight into the crankcase. For an owner-operator, this was a nightmare. You'd pull the dipstick expecting black oil. Instead, you found a gray milky sludge that looked like mayonnaise. That sludge destroyed the bearings. Shortly after you saw the mayo, the engine seized. The Silver 92 was built to fix this. It had a stiffer block and better metallurgy. It was actually a good engine. But for the truckers who had lost their livelihoods to the green leakers, it didn't matter. They didn't see the improvements. They just saw a Detroit 2-stroke and remembered the towing bills. The fallout was brutal. Warranty claims piled up, costing General Motors millions a month. Fleets that had run Jimmies for 30 years finally walked away. They switched to the Cummins Big Cam or the Cat 3406. Detroit Diesel's market share collapsed into the single digits. By 1987, GM made a cold calculation. The division was bleeding cash and the tech was obsolete. They were ready to pull the plug. They planned to shut down the Redford plant and liquidate the assets. The sound of the American century was about to be silenced by a corporate write-off. Then, a new player entered the boardroom, Roger Penske. Penske wasn't a typical industrialist. He was a racer. He ran IndyCar teams with military precision. He saw something in Detroit Diesel that GM didn't, a brand with a strong heartbeat that just lacked discipline. In 1988, Penske stunned the industry by buying 60% of the company. The culture clash was immediate. When Penske walked onto the factory floor in Redford, Michigan, he didn't see a manufacturing plant. He saw a disorganized pit lane. The floors were stained with decades of oil. The lighting was dim. In his world, speed came from order. His first order of business wasn't a new engine. It was a bucket of paint. Penske ordered the factory floors painted bright white. To the old-school union guys, this was insane. A diesel factory is a dirty place. But Penske insisted. If there was a leak, he wanted to see it immediately. If there was dirt, he wanted it gone. He renovated break rooms and upgraded cafeterias. He brought the pit crew mentality to the assembly line, telling workers they weren't just building motors, they were building a reputation. It worked. Mechanics stopped finding loose bolts. Morale shifted from a workforce expecting to get fired to a team trying to win a race. The bleeding stopped. The engineers finally fixed the fretting issues. The results were historic. Through sheer discipline, Detroit Diesel's market share climbed from a dismal 3% to 33% by 1993. Penske had saved the brand from extinction. But Roger Penske was a realist. He knew painting the floor wouldn't stop government regulators. The two-stroke engine, no matter how well built, was a mechanical creature in a world turning digital. He had saved the factory, but to save the future, he had to kill the past. The Series 60 was coming. Roger Penske knew that a fresh coat of paint couldn't stop the laws of thermodynamics. By the early 90s, the diesel industry was hitting a wall. Iron alone wasn't enough anymore. For decades, the highway ran on mechanical governors, springs and flyweights spinning inside the engine to control fuel. It was simple and it was robust, but it was dumb. A mechanical pump couldn't think. It could only react. To push efficiency further, the engine needed a brain. It needed the one thing every old-school mechanic swore they would never touch: a computer. This was the dawn of the black box. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was a culture shock. Drivers were used to fixing rigs with a 9/16 wrench and a flathead. The idea that a microchip could leave you stranded in the desert with a check engine light was terrifying. But while drivers hesitated, Detroit Diesel saw the future. The Series 60 didn't just add a computer to an old design, it was built around the electronics from the oil pan up. Gone was the screaming two-stroke that had defined the brand for 50 years. In its place sat a clean-sheet 4-stroke inline 6. It had an overhead camshaft, rare for heavy-duty diesels back then, which allowed for massive injection pressures. But the real magic was the DDEC, Detroit Diesel Electronic Control. This system replaced the throttle cable with a wire. When you stepped on the pedal, you weren't pulling a linkage, you were sending a digital signal. The computer calculated exactly how much fuel to spray based on boost, temperature, and load, thousands of times per second. The results were undeniable. The Series 60 sipped fuel while cruising and poured on the power when climbing. By 1992, it was the most popular heavy-duty engine in North America. They eventually sold 1.2 million of them. Detroit proved that electronics could survive the million-mile grind. The industry had a choice: digitize or die. Cummins wasn't about to let Detroit walk away with the market. They had a legacy to protect. They responded with one of the most legendary engines ever bolted between two frame rails, the N14. Cummins took a different approach. They didn't start from scratch. They looked at their venerable 855 cubic inch block, the iron backbone of the big cam, and evolved it. Veterans call the N14 an 855 with the brain. It kept the heavy iron bottom end, but replaced the mechanical fueling with the Select and Select Plus digital system. The clash between the Series 60 and the N14 created the golden era of trucking. On the one side, the Detroit Series 60, the fleet darling, lightweight, fuel efficient, and smooth. On the other side, the Cummins N14, the driver's engine. It had that deep-chested torque that ironed out hills, but now it had the cold start reliability of a computer. To this day, these engines are the holy grail of the used market. They represent the sweet spot. Mechanical reliability meets electronic precision. What made this era special was the balance. The engineers were using computers to make the engines run better, not just cleaner. You could plug a handheld tool like the ProLink into the dash and see exactly what the cylinders were doing. Horsepower wars were now fought with software. A truck could leave the factory with 430 horses and with a simple recalibration be bumped to 500. Drivers who once cursed the black box fell in love with it. These engines didn't smoke, they didn't need constant tinkering, and they pulled harder for longer. It felt like the industry had reached perfection. But looking back, we didn't realize we were living in a brief window of time. The engineers had focused all that new digital power on performance, but in the halls of government, a new mandate was being written. The EPA was changing the rules, and the clean, efficient hum of the golden era was about to be choked off. By 2006, the engineers had perfected the diesel engine. We had the perfect balance of power, durability, and efficiency. Then, the EPA walked in. New mandates for 2007 and 2010 drew a line in the sand. The era of black smoke and deep breathing was over. The era of the after-treatment system had begun. For the truck owner, this introduced three new enemies that would haunt maintenance logs for a decade: EGR, DPF, and DEF. EGR, exhaust gas recirculation, was the first band-aid. The concept was simple, but brutal. To lower combustion temperatures, the engine had to inhale a portion of its own exhaust. You were essentially asking an athlete to run a marathon while breathing through a straw connected to his own tailpipe. That recirculated soot acted like sandpaper inside the cylinders, while the extra heat broke down the oil faster than ever. Then came the DPF, diesel particulate filter. This ceramic trap caught the soot before it left the stack, but eventually the trap clogs. So the engine has to dump raw fuel into the exhaust to burn the soot off, a regen. Suddenly, trucks meant to haul freight were parked on the shoulder idling at high RPMs just to clean their own filters. Finally, we got DEF, diesel exhaust fluid. Another tank, another pump, and another sensor network to chemically scrub the exhaust. The fallout was immediate. Reliability tanked. The legendary million-mile engine became a myth. Trucks spent as much time in the shop as they did on the road. Turbos choked on soot. Sensors failed. Operating costs skyrocketed. The crisis spawned a rebellion, the glider kit market. Drivers were so desperate to avoid these new systems that they started buying brand new truck chassis fitted with remanufactured pre-emissions engines. Often the very Series 60s and N14s from the 90s. It was the industry voting with its wallet, choosing the reliability of the past over the complexity of the present. But the manufacturers couldn't look back. In the chaos, the two old rivals chose completely different paths to survival. Detroit Diesel stopped trying to sell engines to the world. Now owned by Daimler, they rebranded simply as Detroit. They became the ultimate integrator. If you bought a Freightliner Cascadia, you got a Detroit powertrain. The engine, transmission, and axles were designed to speak the same digital language. The new Detroit DD15 wasn't sold on horsepower, it was sold on downspeeding. By generating peak torque at low RPMs and using automated transmissions to keep it there, Detroit turned the truck into a seamless, fuel-sipping appliance. It became the corporate choice. Cummins refused to be captured. While competitors like Caterpillar rage-quit the on-highway market entirely, Cummins doubled down. They remained the last independent giant, the universal soldier willing to power any chassis. Kenworth, Peterbilt, International, Cummins kept the customer's right to choose alive. The Cummins X15 kept the torch of performance burning. They still offered calibrations for productivity, but they also catered to the heavy haulers who needed raw power. The split defined the modern landscape. Detroit taught the truck how to think. They proved that a computer controlling the entire drivetrain could outdrive a human, squeezing every drop of efficiency from a gallon of fuel. Cummins taught the truck how to work. They proved that there is still value in raw, adaptable torque, and that the engine should be a separate heart capable of beating inside any chest. Today, that rivalry has settled into a quiet dominance. The screaming two-strokes are gone, replaced by the hush of common rail injection and the chemically scrubbed exhaust. The war that began between a chauffeur in a garage and a general in a laboratory is finally over. It drove the industry from primitive, clattering iron to sophisticated digital systems. It gave us a global supply chain that is cleaner, smarter, and infinitely more efficient. But ask any veteran, and they'll tell you, it is a little less soulful. Detroit flourishes as the brain of the Daimler ecosystem. Cummins stands alone as the independent muscle for everyone else. The noise has faded, but the wheels keep turning. So, which team are you on? Are you running a Crimson Cummins or an integrated Detroit? Let us know in the comments.